Hello, fabulous friends! Welcome to our awesome counting adventure. I'm Yusuf, and I'm super excited to have you all here with me today. Today, we're going to explore the amazing world of numbers from 1 to 50. Are you ready to join me? Awesome! Let's jump right in! All right, friends, let's start with the number 1. Can you say 1? That's it! Now, let's move on to number 2. Say it with me, 2. Now, let's move on to number 3. Say it with me, 3 now. Let's move on to number 4. Say it with me, 4. Now let's move on to number 5. Say it with me, 5. Now let's move on to number 6. Say it with me, 6. Now let's move on to number 7. Say it with me, 7. Now let's move on to number 8. Say it with me, 8. Now let's move on to number 9. Say it with me, 9. Now let's move on to number 10. Say it with me, 10. Now let's move on to number 11. Say it with me, 11. Now let's move on to number 12. Say it with me, 12. Now, let's move on to number 13. Say it with me, 13. Now, let's move on to number 14. Say it with me, 14. Now, let's move on to number 15. Say it with me, 15. Now, let's move on to number 16. Say it with me, 16. Now, let's move on to number 17. Say it with me, 17. Now, let's move on to number 18. Say it with me, 18. Now, let's move on to number 19. Say it with me, 19. Now, let's move on to number 20. Say it with me, 20. Now let's move on to number 21. Say it with me, 21. Now let's move on to number 22. Say it with me, 22. Now let's move on to number 23. Say it with me, 23. Now let's move on to number 24. Say it with me, 24. Now let's move on to number 25. Say it with me, 25. Now let's move on to number 26. Say it with me, 26. Now let's move on to number 27. Say it with me, 27. Now, let's move on to number 28. Say it with me, 28. Now, let's move on to number 29. Say it with me, 29. Now, let's move on to number 30. Say it with me, 30. Now, let's move on to number 31. Say it with me, 31. Now, let's move on to number 32. Say it with me, 32. Now, let's move on to number 33. Say it with me, 33. Now, let's move on to number 4. 1. Say it with me, 34. Now, let's move on to number 35. Say it with me, 35. Now, let's move on to number 36. Say it with me, 36. Now, let's move on to number 37. Say it with me, 37. Now, let's move on to number 38. Say it with me, 38. Now, let's move on to number 39. Say it with me, 39. Now, let's move on to number 40. Say it with me, 40. Now, let's move on to number 41. Say it with me, 41. Now, let's move on to number 42. Say it with me, 42. Now, let's move on to number 43. Say it with me, 43. Now, let's move on to number 44. Say it with me, 44. Now, let's move on to number 45. Say it with me, 45. Now, let's move on to number 46. Say it with me, 46. Now, let's move on to number 47. Say it with me, 47. Now, let's move on to number 48. Say it with me, 48. Now, let's move on to number 49. Say it with me, 49. Last one is now. Let's move on to number 50. Say it with me, 50. Well done, everyone. I hope you had as much fun as I did. Remember, numbers are everywhere around us, so keep practicing and exploring. Until next time, keep shining bright and keep counting. Goodbye, friends. Please subscribe to our channel for more interesting videos. Keep smiling. Bye-bye.